The rain was coming down in sheets, relentlessly pounding the ground, turning the city lights into smudges of color and drowning out every sound except the echo of water splashing against the pavement. I stood in the parking garage, gazing out at the view that stretched far beyond, the distance feeling infinite. Even though I was just a few feet away, she didn't see me. She couldn't, her back was to me. She was laughing at something the man next to her had said, a carefree, soft laugh that once belonged to me. Now, it lingered between them, mixing with the mist rolling across the rooftop before fading into the night. I hadn't meant to witness this. I had stayed late at work, trudging through the rain, too exhausted to care that I'd forgotten my umbrella. By the time I reached the garage, I was completely soaked. But as I stepped out of the elevator, there they were, them. She with him, standing under a dim, flickering light, looking like something straight out of a movie I'd never want to see. My heart thudded in my chest, the sound of my blood pulsing so loudly that her laughter almost became a distant hum. She playfully tapped his arm and lingered. I saw her fingers pause just a bit too long on his sleeve, and he leaned slightly toward her in response. My stomach churned as he tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear, his hand lingering a little too long on her cheek. I stood there, frozen, as he moved closer, their laughter slowly fading, replaced by a quiet intimacy that felt unbearable to witness. She tilted her head, just enough, meeting him halfway. And then their lips touched, soft and brief, as if it were only the beginning of something. I felt like an intruder, yet it was my own life, my own wife, who had stolen into this moment with him. I stepped back into the shadows, my footsteps silent against the wet concrete. My mind raced, each thought weaving into the next, impossible to untangle. How had we arrived here? She had been everything to me, my partner, in every sense. But now, as I walked away, an emptiness replaced what had once been our connection, a hollow ache that grew with each step. The changes had been so small, almost imperceptible. The late nights at work, the sudden flurry of texts she'd brush off with a half-hearted excuse, the distance in her voice, the half-finished sentences that left me feeling like a stranger in my own life. By the time I reached my car, I slumped into the driver's seat, staring at the rain trickling down the windshield. She hadn't seen me. She hadn't noticed a thing. For a brief moment, I thought about confronting her, stepping into the light, calling out her name, demanding answers. But the anger in my chest was quickly smothered by confusion and grief, pressing me deep into the seat. I couldn't face her, not yet. Not after what I had seen. Not until I understood what it meant. For her. For us. For everything we'd built. I started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, merging onto the nearly empty street. The wipers struggled to keep up with the downpour. I drove aimlessly, passing familiar streets and neon-lit stores that blurred in the corner of my vision. My hands gripped the wheel, fingers clenched so tightly my knuckles ached. Every stoplight triggered another wave of nausea, a replay of that rooftop moment. The closeness, the warmth, the betrayal that wasn't mine to claim, but still shattered something deep inside me. When I finally got home, I was drenched in more than just rain. I sat in the driveway, watching the lights flicker behind the curtains, knowing she was inside, probably already in her comfortable clothes, wrapped in the familiarity of a place that still felt like home, at least to her. For me, everything felt foreign. The rooms that once felt like mine now seemed like a movie set, a prop in a scene that didn't belong to me anymore. I took a deep breath before stepping out of the car and entering the house. She was in the kitchen, rinsing a glass at the sink. She looked up and smiled, a reflex, nothing more, but I could still see that warmth in her eyes. The love that, for a second, seemed as real as it had always been. But then my thoughts returned to the rooftop, and my smile faded. I muttered something about a long day, blaming the rain for my soaked clothes. She nodded, drying her hands, not even bothering to check the time. As she climbed into bed beside me, pulling the covers up to her chin, I lay there, staring at the ceiling, counting the raindrops against the window. Each one felt like a reminder, like a ticking clock counting down to an inevitable end. I could feel her warmth beside me, her slow breathing, even the gentle brush of her arm as she shifted in her sleep. I wanted to turn toward her, to reach out and pull her close, to pretend nothing had changed. But all I could see was her face under that dim rooftop light, leaning in toward someone else. Her laugh still echoed faintly in my mind. I lay there for hours, unable to sleep, my mind a tangled mess of questions I didn't dare ask. When the first light of dawn crept through the window, I felt the weight of the night bearing down on me. I knew things couldn't stay the same. Something had shifted, and now, no matter what it took, I was going to find out where it had gone wrong. A few days passed, but the memory of the rooftop scene haunted me, creeping into every quiet moment, distracting me at work, filling my thoughts at night. I knew I couldn't keep pretending it didn't affect me. I couldn't keep burying what I had seen. I tried to convince myself that I had misunderstood, that maybe it wasn't what it seemed. After all, it was just a kiss. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe I was just overreacting. But the weight of that lie pressed on my chest, suffocating me. I knew I had to talk to her, find some clarity. But each time I tried, the words stuck in my throat. She was either rushing out the door with her phone in hand or lost in her thoughts, a distant look in her eyes. I kept telling myself tonight would be the night I'd ask, that I'd finally have the courage to confront her. But when the night came, I lost my nerve. Then, one chilly Thursday evening, I asked if we could spend some time together. I suggested we go for dinner at a cozy spot downtown, one of our favorite places, but she hesitated. She glanced at her phone before offering me a forced smile and agreeing. I wanted to believe she was just distracted, that work or life had her preoccupied. But as she disappeared into the bedroom to get ready, an unsettling feeling tugged at me, something that told me she was slipping further away. We walked into the restaurant in silence, and the distance between us felt like an impenetrable wall. She sat across from me, absorbed in her phone, her face illuminated by the dim light from the screen. I cleared my throat, trying to get her attention, but she barely looked up. Frustration built in my chest, a thick knot that was hard to ignore. I opened my mouth, ready to confront her, to demand some kind of explanation. But I held back, reminding myself that now wasn't the time. Not here.
Not now.
After dinner, she said she was tired and asked if it would be all right if she went to meet some friends instead of coming home with me. My heart dropped, but I forced a smile, telling her it was fine, even though every part of me wanted her to stay. She gave me a quick hug, not meeting my eyes, and slipped away, vanishing into the night. I wasn't sure what to do next, so I wandered aimlessly through the city streets. The sounds of traffic and laughter filled the air, but my thoughts were elsewhere. I told myself to just go home, let her have her space. But before I knew it, my feet had carried me in the opposite direction. I found myself standing outside a small cafe near the park, the same place where I'd seen her with our friend that rainy night. The memories hit me all at once, and my chest tightened as I looked through the glass windows. There she was, sitting at a small corner table. She hadn't noticed me yet, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. Her head was tilted slightly, her smile soft as she listened to him talk. Her hand rested just close enough to his, their fingers almost touching. They shared a laugh, and in that moment, she looked more alive than I'd seen in weeks. She leaned in, her face inches from his, eyes sparkling in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. Then, before I could look away, he reached across the table, his fingers brushing her cheek in a soft, almost reverent gesture. She didn't pull back. Instead, she closed her eyes briefly, leaning into his touch. Anger flared up inside me, raw and hot, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, forced to watch as he leaned in closer, their faces just inches apart. And then, in a moment that felt endless, their lips met. This kiss was different from the one I'd seen before.
Slower. Softer.
It carried a weight that spoke of something more than just a fleeting impulse. It felt like a secret, something they'd shared countless times before, something I wasn't a part of. A sharp pain sliced through me, and I stumbled back. My heart pounded as I turned and rushed away, walking blindly through the streets. The city lights blurred around me, a cold wind cutting through my jacket as I tried to process what I'd just witnessed.
There was no denying it now.
No pretending it was a misunderstanding or a brief moment of weakness. Whatever was going on between them was real, tangible, something that crossed the line I thought we'd both agreed never to cross. When I finally made it home, the silence felt suffocating, the walls closing in as I sat in the dark. My mind was racing, but I couldn't bring myself to confront her yet. I tried to convince myself I would ask her about it, that I deserved the truth, but as the hours passed, my anger faded, replaced by a hollow ache that gnawed at me. She still hadn't come home, and for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted to be there when she did. The house felt empty, foreign. It no longer felt like home. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of resolve. The events of the night before had drained me, leaving me raw, but I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. She was slipping further away with each passing day, avoiding me at every turn. If I didn't confront her now, I might never get the chance. I rehearsed what I wanted to say over and over, pacing in the kitchen, but the words never came out right. The moment I heard her car pull into the driveway, my heart quickened with a strange sense of purpose. She walked through the door, her expression unreadable, a faint exhaustion in her eyes. I noticed how quietly she moved, as if trying not to disturb the tension between us. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my voice.
Can we talk?
I asked, gesturing toward the living room. She looked at me for a moment, her face giving nothing away, before nodding and following me. The silence between us was suffocating, thick with unspoken words. My throat tightened as I struggled to find the courage to speak. I know something's been going on, I began, my voice softer than I'd intended.
She didn't react.
I just stared at her hands, her fingers fidgeting nervously. A surge of frustration welled up in me, and I wanted her to acknowledge it, to show some sign that she understood the gravity of what I was saying. I saw you, I continued, my voice firmer now. I saw you with him. Her eyes flickered up at me, and I saw a flash of surprise before she quickly masked it, closing off whatever emotions were there. I don't know what you mean, she replied, her tone calm, almost too calm. It felt like I was talking to a stranger, someone who knew how to hide behind their words, and it broke my heart in a way I couldn't put into words. Nothing's going on, she added, her voice steady and convincing, and for a moment, I almost wanted to believe her. But the memory of their kiss was too vivid, too real to ignore. Please, I said, desperation creeping into my voice.
Just be honest with me.
I saw the way you looked at him. I saw everything. She went silent, her gaze dropping again, and I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she tried to keep her composure. There was a long pause, and in that silence, I felt the last traces of trust between us start to crack. Finally, she took a shaky breath, as if preparing herself for something hard. All right, she whispered, almost too softly to hear. Maybe you're right, she said softly, her voice barely audible. Maybe something did happen. I felt my heart drop, an ache spreading through my chest. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Every second seemed like it might slip away if I did. And in that moment, I was terrified of being left with nothing, just endless, unanswered questions. It wasn't supposed to mean anything, she added, her words fragile, like they might break with the slightest touch. It just happened. Each word she spoke was like a shard of glass, cutting deeper with every sentence. I fought to keep my emotions in check, the weight of her words pressing down on me. I wanted to ask her everything. Why it happened, what led us here, what went wrong. But as I looked at her, seeing the guilt and the uncertainty in her eyes, I realized that no explanation would ease the pain. So, what now? I asked, my voice hollow, drained of all feeling. She stared at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before her gaze softened, filled with something I couldn't place. Regret? Relief? Maybe both. I don't know, she admitted, her voice shaky, almost breaking. I didn't think it would go this far. I never wanted to hurt you. Her words hit me harder than I expected, a rush of emotion crashing over me. I wanted to scream at her, to tell her how much she'd already hurt me, how this whole thing had been unraveling for weeks, each day a slow burn leading to this truth I wasn't ready to accept. But instead, I just nodded, her admission settling like a heavy weight in the pit of my stomach. She had crossed a line that, once crossed, couldn't be erased. And now we were standing on opposite sides of something I didn't think we could ever recover from. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating, filled with all the things we couldn't say to each other. I felt like I was drowning in it. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice barely more than a whisper. Maybe we should take some time apart, she suggested, her words slow, uncertain. She wasn't even looking at me now, as if afraid to say them aloud. I stared at her, shock and disbelief rising in me. This was her solution? After everything we'd been through, this was all she had to offer? Part of me wanted to argue, to fight for whatever was left between us, to hold on to something, anything, that we could salvage. But a quieter part of me, the part that was tired, understood. She needed space. She needed to distance herself from the mess she'd created, to escape the weight of what she'd done. All right, I said, the words feeling foreign, like they weren't even mine. If that's what you need. She looked at me then, her eyes filled with a strange mix of sadness and some other emotion I couldn't quite define. For a brief moment, I thought she might reach for me, might try to bridge the distance between us. But she didn't. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, standing up slowly as though her decision was finally settling in. Without another word, she walked away, leaving me to sit in the emptiness she left behind. I stayed where I was, staring at the space she had vacated. The silence felt deafening. There were no more excuses, no more pretending. She had made her choice, and I was left with the shards of what was once my life. The weight of it all pressed down on me, and I stayed there for what felt like hours, watching the room darken as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting everything in a muted, sorrowful light. The world outside kept moving, oblivious to the devastation unfolding inside the walls of our home. And in that moment, I realized that this was it, the end of something I thought was unbreakable. The days that followed felt like I was walking through someone else's life. The house, once filled with warmth and familiarity, now felt cold and alien. Every room held echoes of a past I no longer recognized. I hadn't seen her since that night. She'd gone to stay with her sister, calling it temporary, but it already felt like a permanent goodbye. I carried on with my days, moving through them like a ghost. Work became a refuge, a place to escape from the overwhelming weight of everything. It was easier to lose myself in tasks, in numbers, than to face the emptiness that awaited me when I returned home. But no matter how much I tried to numb myself, the ache was always there. The car ride home was a silent reminder, the streets stretching out in front of me as I drove aimlessly, unwilling to go back to a place that no longer felt like mine. I hadn't talked to anyone about what happened. I didn't know how to explain it, and I wasn't sure I could without falling apart. One evening, as I scrolled through my phone, I saw she had posted something on social media. A simple photo, just a coffee cup on a table, an open book beside it, sunlight streaming through a window. The caption read, "Finding Peace." A sharp pang hit me as I stared at the photo, wondering if she had already found the peace I was still desperately searching for. Did she miss me at all? Did she feel even a fraction of the emptiness that had become my constant companion? I closed my eyes, trying to push the thoughts away, but they kept coming. Memories of her laughter, the way she had once looked at me, moments that now felt monumental. Each memory pierced through me, sharp and unforgiving. How could something that felt so solid, so permanent, crumble so quickly? I was left to grapple with a loss so profound that words couldn't capture it. The next morning, I woke up to a text from her. It was brief, just a few lines, asking if she could come by and pick up some things. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding as I read her message over and over. It was such a simple request, but it carried the weight of everything we hadn't said. I replied with a curt sure, tossing my phone aside, a strange mix of dread and anticipation churning in my stomach. That evening, I found myself pacing the living room, watching the clock tick by. When I heard her car pull up, I took a deep breath, steeling myself for whatever was coming next. She walked in quietly, her face unreadable, moving cautiously, as if walking on fragile ground. I watched her silently as she gathered a few things, slipping them into a bag without saying a word. "Is this it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She paused, her back to me, her shoulders tight with tension. For a moment, I thought she wouldn't answer, would leave without saying a word. But then she turned to face me, her eyes meeting mine. The look in them was a mixture of sadness and something else, regret, maybe. Something I couldn't quite name. "I don't know," she said softly, her voice fragile, almost breaking. "I don't have the answers. I just know that I need space. I need time to figure things out." Her words hung in the air, heavy and uncertain, each one deepening the ache in my chest. I swallowed, trying to keep the lump in my throat from choking me. "Time?" I repeated, as if saying it aloud might bring some clarity, some sense of direction.
How much time?
She looked away, avoiding my gaze. "I don't know," she replied, her voice trembling. "Maybe a few weeks, maybe longer." Each word she spoke felt like a cold splash of water, intensifying the weight pressing down on me.
She didn't know.
She couldn't even offer me that small comfort. I took a shaky breath, forcing myself to stay composed. "So, what am I supposed to do? Just wait? Pretend like none of this is happening?" She turned back to me then, her face contorted with pain. "I don't expect you to wait," she said quietly.
I don't even know what I expect.
I need to figure out who I am, who we are." Her words were hollow, a vague echo of every cliché I'd ever heard. Yet hearing them from her, they stung, sharp and real. I looked at her, trying to find any trace of the person I thought I knew, the person I thought I had built a life with. But all I saw was a stranger, someone I didn't recognize. Without another word, she turned toward the door, stopping only for a brief moment to glance back. "Take care of yourself," she murmured, her voice barely audible. And then she was gone, leaving behind a silence that stretched out forever, a void where everything that once mattered now felt distant. I collapsed onto the couch, the weight of her absence settling in, suffocating. Every creak in the house, every small sound, seemed to amplify, each one a painful reminder that she was gone. I couldn't believe this was the end, that after everything we'd been through, we were reduced to a few hollow words and an empty house. The silence was crushing. And yet, within it, I felt a strange clarity. The following days blurred into one another, each one a mirror of the last. Work, sleep, an overwhelming emptiness that I couldn't escape. I kept hoping for a message, a call, anything that might suggest this was just temporary, that she'd come back. But as the days turned into weeks, that hope slowly bled away, leaving behind a hollow ache that wouldn't fade. I began to wonder if I had ever really known her, if the life we had built was just an illusion, something fragile that had shattered the moment it was tested. I thought about reaching out, about trying to close the distance between us. But every time I picked up my phone, hesitation gripped me. What could I possibly say? What could I offer that would change anything? And so I did nothing. I let the silence drag on. The days passed, each one taking me further from the life I thought I knew. I buried myself in work, in a routine that felt like the only thing holding me together. It gave me some semblance of control, a way to keep the pieces of myself from falling apart. But no matter how busy I kept myself, the ache never left. It was a constant, a shadow that loomed over everything. Weeks turned into months. The hope I had clung to was replaced by a quiet acceptance. She had made her choice. And now, I was left to pick up the pieces of a life that no longer felt like mine. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if I would ever find the peace that had eluded me. But as I looked out at the world beyond my empty home, I knew one thing with painful certainty. There was no going back. The house grew emptier by the day, a hollow shell of the life we had once shared. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months. And I was still here, still trying to adjust to the quiet, to the absence, and to the ache that filled every empty room. I tried to move on, to convince myself that her absence was temporary, that this was just a pause. But no matter how much I tried to fill the space, the weight of her leaving lingered. It settled into my bones, coloring everything, even the smallest of moments, with a dull sense of loss. One evening, as I sat alone in the silence, my phone chimed softly, breaking the stillness. It was a message from an old friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in a while. The text was simple, almost casual. "Hey, it's been a while. Let's catch up sometime." There was nothing unusual about it on the surface, but something in me hesitated. This was someone who had been there through it all, through the highs and lows of my relationship with her. And now, with everything that had happened, I wasn't sure I was ready to face the memories he might bring up. But loneliness has a way of softening even the sharpest hesitations, so I replied, agreeing to meet. We set up a time to meet at a small bar downtown, a place we'd frequented years ago, when everything felt simpler. As I walked through the door, memories flooded back. The laughter, the stories, the warmth of friendships that once seemed unbreakable. But tonight, everything felt different. The past, though familiar, seemed so distant now. He was already there, sitting at a corner table, a faint smile spreading across his face as he waved me over. We settled into conversation, the awkwardness slowly melting away as familiarity took over. We talked about work, about the mundane details of daily life, carefully avoiding the one subject that hung in the air between us. I could tell he was trying to gauge my mood, trying to figure out how to bring it up without shattering the fragile peace we'd found. Finally, after a pause, he cleared his throat and asked, "So, how have you been holding up?" It was a simple question, but it carried more weight than he knew. I hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal, unsure if I was ready to talk about any of it. But something in his eyes made me feel like I could let my guard down. "It's been strange," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I thought I knew her. I thought I knew us. But now, looking back, it feels like I was seeing only what I wanted to see." The words came slowly, like I was piecing together fragments of a truth I hadn't fully understood until now. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's tough," he said quietly. "I mean, from the outside, everything looked perfect." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But I guess we never really know what's going on inside someone else's life, do we?" We kept talking, touching on memories and shared experiences, each one tinged with a sense of loss. But as we spoke, I felt something shift, a strange sense of clarity. Maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as alone as I had thought. He had known her too, had seen the subtle shifts in our lives, even if he hadn't fully understood them. But then, as the evening wore on, he casually dropped a bombshell that left me reeling. Without warning, he mentioned that he had seen her around, not alone. She had been with him, the same man I had seen on the rooftop with her that night. They'd been spotted together, showing up at the same places, as if their lives had effortlessly merged, while mine had come apart at the seams. My stomach churned as a familiar surge of anger and betrayal washed over me. I'd suspected it, of course. I wasn't blind to the signs. But hearing it out loud, knowing she had moved on, knowing she was living a life without me, it was more than I was prepared to face. I tried to keep my expression neutral, to act as if his words hadn't pierced me the way they did, but I could feel my fists tighten under the table. My body was stiff with emotion, barely contained. He seemed to notice, his face softening as he looked at me. "I'm sorry, man," he said, his voice full of regret. "I didn't mean to bring it up like that. I just thought you should know." His words were sincere, but they did little to soothe the ache that had spread in my chest. I nodded, swallowing hard, forcing a smile. "No, it's fine. Really. I guess I needed to hear it." The words felt hollow, but I said them anyway, keeping up the pretense of calm as my mind spun with thoughts I couldn't control. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. The conversation drifted to lighter topics, both of us trying to ignore the heavy truth that had just been laid bare. But as I walked home that night, the streets were empty and silent, and I felt the full weight of the reality I'd been avoiding. She was gone.
Truly gone.
And there was nothing I could do to change that. Back at home, I sat in the dark, the silence settling around me like a weight. I thought about reaching out to her, asking for answers, for some kind of closure. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. She had made her choice, and all I could do now was try to figure out how to move on. The next morning, I woke with an unfamiliar sense of resolve. It wasn't peace, nothing like that, but there was a quiet determination, a need to take back control of my life. I started small, moving things around the house, packing away the items that reminded me of her. It was painful, each task more difficult than the last, but with every small change, I felt a little lighter, a little closer to finding myself again. As the days stretched into weeks, I began to create a new routine, one that didn't revolve around her. I reconnected with old friends, picked up hobbies I'd long abandoned, filled my time with things that gave me some purpose, however small. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the ache returned, a dull reminder of the life I had lost. But slowly I started to heal. Slowly I began to rebuild. One evening, as I sat alone looking out at the city lights, I felt something I hadn't in a long time, a strange, fleeting sense of peace. It wasn't much, but it was there. A reminder that life, somehow, would go on. That maybe, just maybe, I could find happiness again. For the first time, I felt a flicker of hope, a quiet belief that eventually I might be okay. Months passed, and life began to settle into a new rhythm. The quiet of the house no longer felt suffocating. I learned to fill the silence with books, music, the faint hum of the city outside. There was a peace in it, though it was a lonely one I hadn't expected to embrace but found myself clinging to. Then one night, as I was sorting through a box of old things I had nearly forgotten about, my phone buzzed on the table. I glanced at it, expecting a message from a friend or maybe a reminder about some forgotten appointment. But when I saw the name on the screen, my heart stopped. It was her. My hands shook as I picked up the phone. Her message was short, simple, almost cold. "Can we meet?" I stared at the screen, questions swirling in my mind. Why now? After all this time, after the silence, the distance, why reach out now? Part of me wanted to ignore it, to leave it unread, to treat it like a chapter one had closed long ago. But despite my better judgment, I found myself replying, setting a time and place, as if in a trance. We met at a small cafe on the edge of town, a place we'd once loved. She was already there when I arrived, sitting by the window. Her face was unreadable, her posture tense. I sat across from her, and the weight of everything we hadn't said pressed heavily between us. She looked at me for a long moment, then opened her mouth to speak, but hesitated. Finally, she whispered, I'm not sure I made the right choice." The words hit me harder than I expected. They broke through the quiet defenses I had so carefully built.
I didn't know what to say.
I didn't know if there was anything left to say. She looked away, her eyes brimming with unshed tears, as if she realized the depth of what she had just admitted. As I opened my mouth, searching for the right words, she reached out. Her hand trembled as it hovered just short of mine. Our eyes locked, and in that moment, I saw a sadness in her that I had never seen before. And in that instant, I felt the weight of everything we'd lost, and everything we might have been. But before I could respond, she whispered, barely audible, I shouldn't have come." She pulled back, stood up, and walked out, leaving me there, alone in the dim cafe light, surrounded by questions I knew might never have answers.